Hi, this is Mike from MikeEckman.com. Today I have an Argus C3 35mm rangefinder camera, and I'm going to show the proper way to change lenses on this camera. The Argus C series has a mount that many collectors have described as being overly difficult to change, and while it does have a few steps that you don't see on most cameras, I don't think it's as difficult as people make it out to be. So I'm going to show that correct process. This camera has the 50mm Centaur lens that most of them typically have, but I also have the 35mm Sandmar wide-angle lens and the 100mm Sandmar telephoto lens, and I'll show you how those go on and off. The first step to removing any lens from an Argus camera is to always set the focus distance on the rangefinder to 3 feet. That's the minimum focus, and that's necessary on the older cameras and even the later ones to help get this central coupling ring off. You'll notice this is an older pre-war Argus from about 1940. This cap, which goes over the gear, is a little bit larger than the gear below it. I have here an Argus Standard, which is a later model from the late 50s. You'll see that the cap is slightly smaller than the gear behind it, which makes it a little bit easier to get off. But I'm going to work on the pre-war camera. So we have the camera, step 1, set to 3 feet. The next step is just simply unscrew this cap. On the later one, you kind of have to put your thumb in the middle and help twist it off, and it'll come off pretty easily. The next step is just simply remove this idler gear. It just lifts off. That one came off really easily. Sometimes you kind of have to wiggle them a little bit for them to come free, but with the gear off, essentially you have a screw mount camera, and you just unscrew the lens. Okay, so I've taken the Centaur lens off the camera, and we can see the standard screw mount, lens mount. We'll start with putting the wide angle lens on first. First step on these is to set them to infinity, which you can see I have set right there. And then you have to set the rangefinder to infinity too. Some Arguses are a little stiffer than others. That can be resolved by cleaning them, but this one's not too bad. So with the rangefinder set to infinity and the lens set to infinity, simply screw it on. Okay, you want to put it on fairly tight. You want to take the idler gear. This is actually a filter. Let me take it off. Or I'm sorry, the hood. It's a little bit easier to see. So I'm just going to take my idler gear and I'm just going to press it back on. And sometimes you kind of have to wiggle a little bit to get it to go in place. Making a liar out of me. There you go. It's snapped into place. Notice the rangefinder is still set to infinity and the lens is still set to infinity. You simply take your cap, screw it back on, and you're done. That's it. So I've mounted the wide angle lens with the both set to infinity. You know that your lens is properly coupled. You'll notice that in some cases, it's actually very common with these cameras, the depth of field scale sometimes is not perfectly centered. That can be fixed. There is documentation in the Argus manual that shows you how to do that. But let me just take this off. Whoops, sorry. Let's set it back to infinity. Or minimum focus, I'm sorry. Screw this off. Lift the ring out. Unscrew the lens. Okay. I don't know if this will show up in the video, but in the threads, there are tiny little grub screws. There's a couple of them. There's another one right there. There's another one right there. If you find that when the lens is properly screwed on, the depth of field scale isn't pointed straight up, you can loosen those screws and the actual threads will rotate a little bit, and you kind of just do it through trial and error to make sure that when the lens is on fully tight, the actual scale is pointed straight up. It's not a requirement to use the camera though. So here, let me put the lens hood back on and I'll show you how to mount. I'll do that later, I guess. Here is the the telephoto. So once again, we want to set it to infinity. Set this to infinity. Screw it on. Okay, it's on. Take your idler gear, press it back on. There, that went on easier. Take your cap, put the cap back on, tight, and there you go. I have the telephoto. Now, for mounting the Centaur, there actually is a different step involved in that. The reason being is that if you look, both of the Sanmars and I think all of the Argus accessory lenses, this gear goes completely 360 degrees around the whole lens, whereas on the Centaur, it only goes a part of the way. You can see it's smooth throughout here, and then the gears only come where it actually needs to be. So let's take the wide angle off, the telephoto off, sorry. Okay, we're gonna take this. Okay, so the first step on this is set it to infinity, just like the others say, and then you just screw it on. Okay, so the reason you don't have to preset the lens focus is because the lens itself changes depending on where you have it. So I don't know if you can see it on here, but the teeth, if I were to try and push this gear on, it won't go because the teeth aren't in the correct orientation. What you need to do is, with the lens on fully tight, back it off until you start to see the teeth. This is probably the hardest part. And when you put the gear, the idler gear back on, you want to make sure that it's engaged on, hopefully you can see that, on the very first tooth. If, let's just say, with this at infinity, let's say I'm going to do it wrong on purpose. Let's say I did that and put it on. The idler gear meshes with the teeth okay, but you've gone beyond infinity, and if I try to go close, I'm going to reach the end of the teeth too quickly, and the rangefinder is not accurate to the lens. So let's put it back to how I had it. We're going to set the rangefinder to infinity, take this back off. I'm going to change that there. And this is kind of a little bit of trial and error. Like I said, it is not the most ideal setup for installing lenses on an interchangeable lens camera, and this is probably the reason why people get irritated with these, but it's really not that bad. So I have it on there correctly, put the cap back on, and I'm done. So there I've shown you the proper way to install, remove and install the 50mm Centaur, the 35mm wide angle Sandmar, which is a really fantastic lens, by the way. If you ever have an Argus C2 or C3 and you want to shoot good pictures on it, this is a really great lens. And then you also have the telephoto lens, which is good too, but it's a little less practical because the viewfinder is so tiny with the 100mm focal length. Thanks, and have a good day.